Okay, thank you, James. Great to be with all of you today in beautiful Halifax. Yes, want to be sensitive to the time, and so wanted to just present a little bit of information and then hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and discussion and comments. But maybe just to share a little bit about what interested me in this topic before delving in is actually as James mentioned, I'm also a pastor in a church. I was just actually getting an emergency call that I'll have to attend to after this lecture, but from someone in church. And one thing that I run into a lot as a pastor and as an evangelist in the urban African-American community in St. Louis where I serve is this perception that Christianity is a white man's religion or it's a Western religion. And so Christianity, there's a lot of kind of a wall up between, for many people, when it comes to Christianity, because when people think of Christianity, they think of slavery and plantations and the way the Bible was used to commit atrocities, and as well as for indigenous peoples. And so this really led me to investigate this. And even when I went to college to study theology and seminary, I started wondering myself, well, yeah, I don't know if that was a positive or a negative reaction to the lecture, but yeah, I was wondering that myself because I was inundated with books and history and even professors that were predominantly white males. And so it would lead me to think that perhaps this is a religion of white males, because that's everyone who seems to be representing it at the schools that I go to. And maybe, just by a show of hands, do a little starter quiz. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have ever heard of Martin Luther or have heard the name Martin Luther? Okay, how about John Calvin? Anybody raise a hand? Or have you heard the name Thomas Aquinas? Anybody? Okay, so now raise your hand if you have ever heard of Walata Petros. Or how about Narsai? Or how about Zara Yacob? Okay. Oh, we got one. All right. Amen. But, I think that this example, even right now, that's a living example of why people see Christianity as a Western religion. And maybe everyone here is not a professor or a student of theology or Christian history, but you've all heard of the names of European theologians and even people who are actually theologians or scholars have not heard of the second list of names that I gave you, who are African or are Asian theologians who also wrote just as much theology and were just as prominent in their context as the European ones are. And so this is why I'm so grateful for St. Mary's engaging in this conversation, because it's that's a reason why it's important. Some of the ways that we, even as people who are practicing Christians or people who study Christianity, maybe unintentionally give off this perception that it is a Western religion in those kind of ways. And so real quick, before delving into the meat of what we're going to talk about today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how it came to this point that Christianity became seen as a Western religion. We know it's not a Western religion. It came from Palestine, from people who themselves were actually colonized people. Jesus and the apostles were Hebrews who were colonized by the Roman Empire, and they spoke Aramaic, and Christianity grew at the borders of the Roman and Persian empires and was from the very beginning an international religion. We see in Acts chapter 2 that there were Jews from every nation under heaven that were gathered, and when the Holy Spirit fell, people were speaking multitudes of languages. So this is a really different way of viewing religion in the ancient world, where it's this intentionally cosmopolitan and culturally inclusive faith that is very unique in the ancient world. So how did we go from that to seeing it as this Western religion? And oftentimes, especially those of us in the West, in the US and Canada and even other parts of the world, we usually start in the 15th century with the advent of European colonialism and manifest destiny and transatlantic slavery and genocide of indigenous peoples and the way Christianity was used to commit these atrocities. But what I want to do is look before that and show how, these things that were done in the 15th century and the ways that Christianity was weaponized in these dynamics didn't just come out of nowhere in the 15th century, but there was actually a foundation of that. And so it's just a quick summary of that. And I go into this in the first chapter of the book, Multitude of All Peoples, of kind of 1500 year summary of how we get to that point. I would say it really starts in the 4th century. Up until the 4th century, for 300 years, Christianity did not have any geographical or cultural nucleus. Of course, if Christianity ever was going to be associated with being any people's religion, it would have been the Jews, because that's where it came out of. And yet the New Testament itself goes to great lengths to free up the Christian message and practice from its Jewish practices. And we see this in Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 15 and the missions of Paul and others who are trying to communicate the gospel to the Gentiles or to the non-Jews. And so for 300 years, Christianity grew in different places. And I'm going to touch on these in the rest of the lecture. But in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine, we'll say that he opened the doors for Christianity to thrive more in the Roman Empire. Whether he himself, whatever his personal faith was, is a larger conversation. But during his reign, Christianity started to become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire and started to take on lots of Roman culture and started to church structures mirroring Roman political structures and even theological language being embraced primarily through Greco-Roman terminology, which wasn't new. That's something that happened even in the 2nd century. People like Justin Martyr and others, but Clement of Alexandria. But in the 4th century, this is when Christian doctrine became, and what was considered orthodox was framed by Greco-Roman thought. And at the same time, the I guess adverse consequence of the Christianization of Rome, or the Romanization of Christianity, was the martyrdom of Christians in the Persian Empire. Now, Christians were actually in the Persian Empire from the very beginning as well. We see, actually, one could argue that the first Christians in the world were Persians, were Magi who came to visit baby Jesus in his crib and render worship to him. And they were Zoroastrian priests from the Persian Empire. And we see Persians mentioned in Acts 2. And the church was growing in Persia. In fact, in the 2nd century and 3rd century, Christianity was actually a lot more safely practiced in the Persian Empire than it was in the Roman Empire, which is kind of like maybe a different way to think about it, because another way of saying that is that in the 200s, Christianity, it was safer to be a Christian in Afghanistan and Iran than it was in Italy or Greece. And so it's a little bit different than today. But in the 4th century, this flipped because Persian and Roman emperors were rivals with one another. So if Christianity was the Roman religion, even if it was perceived that way, then that created a dynamic in Persia where the Persian emperor began to persecute Christians and force them to convert to Zoroastrianism and begin to promote Zoroastrianism as the Persian national religion. So even to this day, as I was beginning with, people see Christianity as a Western religion, and for many people it's a non-starter because it's seen as antithetical or foreign to their ethnic or tribal or cultural identity. And that is a dynamic that many people around the world deal with now today, but that I would say that's really the first time in history where and the Persian Christians were the first ones to really deal with that, to this perception that their religious and ethnic identity didn't go together, and that they had to choose one. But then in the 5th century, then it went from the identity of Christianity being appropriated to also there being a Western theological hegemony. And this really happened at the first major schism in the church. You might have heard of the Protestant Reformation and how that was a major dividing point in the church in the 16th century, and also even the East-West schism of the 11th century between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. But the Council of Chalcedon initiated the first major schism in the church in 451, where this council was talking about how best to talk about the person and nature of Jesus. And there was as I mentioned, there was a kind of a way of communicating Christian orthodoxy in a way that really was rooted in Greco-Roman culture that didn't translate as well. And specifically, the doctrine that came out of that council was that Jesus is one person, but he has two natures. And that even, again, is not a idea that comes out of Scripture in terms of the language of it, of saying that Jesus has one hypostasis, but he has two physis. And so even the difference between person and nature is, again, itself rooted in the Greco-Roman idea of personhood and nature that didn't translate as well into other languages. But Christianity, as I mentioned, was very global and it was in different places. But this was the moment when the Christians in what would later be known majority as Asia or Africa were condemned as heretics by the church in what would later be known as Europe, and were also persecuted, especially during the time of Justinian, Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. And during that time, that's when many of the Christians of Syria and Arabia and also Armenia had also separated from the church, the dominant church of the Roman Empire. And so what this resulted in was the West or Europe beginning to rise and ascend as presenting itself as kind of the central defining force of orthodoxy and what Christian orthodoxy is. And also the marginalization of other Christians in the non-Western world. So even going back to the little question I asked you at the beginning, this is part of why you've heard of certain people and you haven't heard of other people, because many of these other people are rooted in Christian traditions that have unjustifiably been rendered, even today in many modern church history textbooks in the West, are just kind of cursorily dismissed as heretics without actually engaging their theology. But later, this final phase of the rise of Christendom and the sense of the need to be the guardian of Christendom in the West would also further develop and lead into the history that we're more familiar with in the West, in the Americas. But the rise of Islam resulted in two things. Number one, it even further limited and diminished the ability of these Christians who are now had preceded Islam, but were now under Muslim authority in Egypt and North Africa and the Near East and Mesopotamia and in the former Persian Empire, which itself was ended by the followers of Muhammad and the Rashidun Caliphate. But these lands that were now ruled by Muslims, the population were predominantly Christian or were kind of religiously blended. And so that further limited the ability of Christianity to spread into other parts of Asia and Africa in ways that it already was. And this even weakened the Byzantine Empire in Eastern Europe. And so this gave rise to a new power in Northwestern Europe. The Western Rome had already fallen, but especially during the time of Charlemagne the Great, this gave rise to a new superpower that consolidated control and also began to spread Christianity further into Northwestern and Northern Europe as well during the 8th and 9th centuries. And Charlemagne fancied himself as a new Constantine, literally, so in the same way of kind of continuing, even though different culture, different context, right? The Roman Empire and the Carolingian dynasty are vastly different, even though they're in what now is Europe. But this shows the connection between how even the idea of Europe and the West and Western Christianity is there's somewhat of a through line of ideas of Charlemagne continuing this idea of being this Christian emperor, even using the title Caesar Augustus, even in the 8th and 9th centuries. And the Carolingian dynasty didn't last long, but then it really was the inspiration for the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, which really framed Western European history for the next millennium. But soon after the time of Charlemagne in the 10th century, the Crusades were started. And again, this is out of that same desire to be this representative of Christianity in the world, much in the same way that Constantine saw himself as kind of the God's representative. And even Christian bishops and theologians in the Roman Empire presented him also as the kind of the representative of Christianity. And so we're, also even dealing with that in my country, even to this day, of leaders kind of using religion for their own political purposes, and even the church getting behind those leaders and even at the faintest hint of Christian faith and using that as a way of promoting certain agendas. And so this is also sets up this rivalry between the Christian West and the Middle Eastern East or Near East, even though, again, there were many Christians in those areas already, but they were not, from the Western perspective, legitimate or Orthodox Christians. But then after the Crusades failed, it was actually the same kind of sense of being the guardian of Christendom that led into the process of slavery and colonialism that started in the 15th century, because when the first popes called for the colonization of Africa and India and then later the Americas, it was actually out of a desire, just like the Crusades and just like during the Carolingian dynasty, to be a counterbalance to the Islamic powers in the Near East, which themselves were growing wealthy because of their colonization and slavery of East Africa for ever since the 8th century. And so even long before the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade was already fueling various Islamic caliphates throughout the centuries in Baghdad and Damascus and Cairo and later. So the European popes and kings in the 15th century were feeling like, well, we Christians, which Christian and European went together, we Christians need to be a counterbalance to these Muslims because their power is increasing in the world. So we need to increase our power in the world. So they've been colonizing and enslaving East Africa. So let's go in and colonize and enslave West Africa and go in and destroy anything you see and, rape and kill and pillage and plunder and tell them about Jesus. And then they'll become Christians and go to heaven when they die, so it's okay. I'm paraphrasing like papal bulls like Romanus Pontifex or Dum Diversus, but this is kind of the same, again, crusading mentality, wherein these so-called infidels, or that were already using the language of Romanus Pontifex, who are enemies of Christianity, right? Even though the same bull says these are in places that we don't even know, but we already know that they're enemies of Christianity, that God gives us the ability to, again, subjugate them. So again, trying to show that now you can kind of easily see how that leads into the development of Canada and the US and the Americas as we know it. But again, just trying to make this case that there was a foundation, a theological and a kind of the development of a worldview of the Western world, even as it developed in and of itself. But again, to get back to the main point, there was a lot of Christian history and theology in these parts of the world as the West was growing in its power. And so again, Christianity did not begin through the process of colonialism and slavery in other parts of the world, but it was already present. So to make a few comments about Africa, when we look at Africa going back to the early church, there was really four major civilizations in Africa, kind of urbanized civilizations. North Africa, which would be modern Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, or Egypt. And then those were all part of the Roman Empire, which is the red. And then south of the Roman Empire, you had Nubia in modern day Sudan, which actually was a region that was made up of three different kingdoms, Nobatia, Makuri, and Awa, going from north to south, which later actually consolidated when they embraced Christianity and they called themselves Dotawo. And then also we had Axum, or Habesha, or Agazi, which today is called Ethiopia. And the interesting thing is that Christianity was actually present in all of these regions by the end of late antiquity. And not only was present, but it was even the dominant religion in all these places. So this is very much against the idea that Christianity entered Africa through slavery and colonialism, but it was all over Africa. In fact, this is something I really push on I don't actually know how present it is in Canada, but in the US, Africana studies is a growing discipline in many universities. And I'm always saying, well, if we're studying African civilizations, you can't do that without studying Christianity, because even many of the first books that were produced in the continent of Africa were by African Christians. And even much of the architecture from the first up until the 15th century was primarily done by Christians, with churches and monasteries. And also, even as civilizations began to spread and migrate through Central, West, and South Africa and along the Swahili coast, Christianity also spread from these areas into other areas as well. And that's actually an area that I'm working on now in research. But just a few examples. You might have heard of some of the North African theologians that came from Carthage. Like if you've heard of Tertullian, he was a theologian that was the first to use the word Trinity and first to write extensively in Latin. And Perpetua and Felicity were North African Christian martyrs who lived in Carthage around the same time as Tertullian. And also the most famous early church theologian was Augustine, who also lived in Hippo. And but another person you might not have heard of is Queen Kahina. Is there a marker? Oh, that's okay. Well, her name is spelled Kahina, and she was actually the queen of Numidia, which was one of the regions of North Africa at the time of the Islamic conquest. And she actually, although North Africa was conquered by the Muslims and Carthage was destroyed, and then Tunis refounded, she actually successfully fought the Muslims off for for a good number of years and was a Christian queen. And also, this is a picture of the Kairwan Mosque, which is one of the oldest mosques on the continent of Africa, one of the oldest in the world. And you notice that on the pillars of the mosque, you notice an interesting symbol to be in a mosque, which is actually a cross in the middle there. And so this is actually repurposed material from churches that had been destroyed before the conquest. So this is demonstrating the metaphorical, but also the literal Christian foundations upon which Islam entered in North Africa in the 7th century. Now in Egypt, also Egypt was, had Christians from the very beginning. You probably heard of Origen of Alexandria, or Clement of Alexandria, or Athanasius, who was a really prominent theologian at the Council of Nicaea, or Cyril of Alexandria. But I'm intentionally putting emphasis on people who were not as well known and who wrote in languages other than Greek and Latin. Because just like in Africa today, if you familiar with African context, because of colonialism, oftentimes European languages are kind of prized or elevated above African indigenous languages. And it was true in the early church as well. So people who wrote in Latin or Greek were seen as more prestigious than people who wrote in indigenous African languages. So that's why I'm putting more emphasis on some of those. And actually the first theologian to write in the Coptic language, which is the indigenous Egyptian language, was a Christian named Pachomius. And Pachomius was actually the innovator of communal monasticism. And so Anthony the Great is the famous solitary monk. So there was the solitary style of monasticism, and then there was the communal style called Kenobitic, and both of them were Egyptian. But Pachomius was the innovator of communal monasticism, wrote a whole monastic rule for the lifestyle of the monks. And this would later be very influential on Northwestern European Christianity, because monasticism and communal monasticism was really the avenue through which Christianity grew and spread all over Europe in the 6th and 7th century. You think of people like St. Patrick, went to Ireland, and many of the other early Scottish and Irish missionaries who then later went down to Gaul, modern France, and began and supported by Gregory the Great. So, and then you've probably heard of Benedict and the Benedictine rule, but that itself was influenced by the Pachomian rule in Egypt from several centuries before. And this is actually a quote from his biography which was written in Coptic, and talks about his conversion and how he grew up in the former capital of Egypt named Thebes, and how his parents raised him in the traditional religion, but how he actually, when he went to the Nile River, that as the text says, the gods who were present in the Nile River, the alligators and hippos who were being prayed to, actually fled away at the fear of Pachomius, who was a Christian, and then also his parents forced him to drink libations that were poured out for the gods, and the text says he vomited it out because he was a Christian. And so it shows how Egyptian Christianity both rejected many aspects of Egyptian culture, but also embraced them as well. On the top left there, you see a Christian Ankh symbol, which is a famous hieroglyphic symbol, means the symbol of life, and this is actually from a Christian monastery in the 6th century. And another Egyptian monk to know about, who was a later person influenced by Pachomius, was Shenouda of Atrip. And Shenouda is definitely a name to know, because Shenouda is actually the most prolific author in the history of the Egyptian language in any of its phases, which is, one of Earth's oldest languages, right? Whether it's from hieroglyphic to hieratic or demotic or Coptic. Coptic is the final phase of the Egyptian language before it went extinct in the 13th century of the Common Era. So I just think that that's really important to know about, even just for world history, let alone Christian history, that this is another name that many people don't know, but very much should know, because again, the most prolific author in one of Earth's oldest language families was a Christian theologian. Named Shenouda, who wrote a multitude of sermons. He also ran a monastery called the White Monastery. This is actually a painting of him in that monastery that was done around his lifetime. And he was known as a patron of the poor. In this sermon here, he's crying out to God for mercy on behalf of the poor and the oppressed. And then he's also speaking condemnation on he says the Greeks who are godless people who are oppressing the poor. And so he's associating Greek culture with oppressive culture that is actually marginalizing the poor. And he was specifically calling out a specific person named Gesius, who was a wealthy landowner who was exploiting poor people, most of whom were Christians, and were not paying them fair wages and giving them also time off to go to church and worship. And so Shenouda's monastery was not only a place of Christian discipleship, but also of economic empowerment, where he was giving people opportunities to work and teaching them trades. Shenouda also was involved in one of the first mass conversions of Nubians who were refugees living in Egypt. And Nubia became a Christian nation in the various Nubian kingdoms, embraced Christianity in the 6th century. And this is actually a picture of the capital of Dongola, which you see the Nile River in the background, and all these different pillars and foundations are all churches. And so again, this is to just underscore the point that you can't study African history without studying Christianity, because Dongola was the biggest city in sub-Saharan Africa from the 6th up until about the 15th century. And it was full of churches, and it was a Christian hub, and it was also a hub for the trans-Saharan trade. So from Dongola, Christianity spread into other parts of Africa. And we get a hint of that in the wall paintings of the monastery there. On the left, there's a picture of Mary and Jesus. And then next to Mary and Jesus is actually a group of Africans worshiping and praising and praying to Mary. So St. Mary's here. They're praying and calling out to Mary in the Nubian language, and the writings are in the Nubian language. And you notice some of them are even wearing dashikis with cowrie shells and even animal masks with loincloths and percussive instruments. This is a very unique painting. There's a lot of Nubians painted a lot of Christian paintings that you can look up information about, and it really gives a sense of their theology, even more than writing. But this is a unique one, and so this motif of having Africans with masks was very unique to the Nubian context, and it's likely that these are depicting figures that were not Nubian, but they were actually from other places further west in Africa, which is, again, as I mentioned, something I'm looking into now, but also gives us a hint into how Christianity was not only along the Nile River, but was spreading into other places. And then also Ethiopia. Ethiopia was also a Christian nation. It was even a Christian nation before Nubia, and it was during the time of King Ezana. And this is one of the tablets of King Ezana. There was 4 of these, and it tells the story of how he conquered Nubia, actually, and then also embraced Christianity. And even on this tablet, which, again, is itself one of the oldest inscriptions in the Ge'ez language, which is the ancient language of Ethiopia, that it says that it starts by saying, by faith in God, or that word faith in Ethiopian is hymenot, we mentioned earlier, by the hymenot in God, or faith in God, and by the power of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, to the one who saved the kingdom. And then he identifies himself as Ezana. So on this, again, one of the oldest inscriptions in one of the, actually only sub-Saharan African writing systems or alphabets in use today, the first words are invoking the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then also interesting thing, I don't know how much church history like we've all been into before this, but if you're familiar with the Council of Nicaea, where it was the first kind of major imperial council in the Roman Empire, they were arguing about whether or not Jesus was God. There was a person named Arius who said, well, Jesus isn't God, he's less than God, and that was a big debate in the Roman Empire. So I think it's really interesting that at that time, at the same time, in the early 4th century, Christianity was embraced in Ethiopia, and on the imperial inscription, the king actually calls Jesus God. He says, I rose up in the power of God Christ. And so at a time in the Roman Empire when the divinity of Jesus was being debated in Ethiopia, it was clearly embraced. And actually, specifically at this time, Constantine's son, Constantius, was the emperor in Rome, and he was an Arian, promoting Arianism, which was the belief that Jesus is not God. And so at a time when Europe was promoting what would later be seen as heresy, Africa, and Ethiopia in particular, was embracing what would be known as orthodoxy. And so Ethiopia then, after the Aksumite kingdom fell in the 10th century, there was a dynasty called the Zagwes who built an impressive city of rock churches that you might have seen pictures of before. And then there was the Solomonic dynasty, which is really when Ethiopian Christian literature really flowered and continued to grow. Now, in the 17th century, there was an attempt of colonization by the Portuguese in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is really fascinating for many reasons. It's the only predominantly black nation in the world that's never been colonized by a European power, and it's been predominantly Christian since the 4th century. But the king of Ethiopia made a treaty with the Portuguese and began to embrace Portuguese Catholicism and try to enforce it in Ethiopia, which most Ethiopians were not going for because they had their own indigenous form of Christianity that for 1,300 years, the Portuguese came and said, hey, we've come to tell you about Jesus. And this actually, we can tell you about Jesus. We've been Christians since longer than you. But there was one woman in particular who's actually one of the first sub-Saharan African women to have her own biography. So again, this history is just really important for world history, long before people like Phyllis Wheatley or Harriet Jacobs, or to use a Canadian example, Viola Desmond, long before any of these other really important women as well. You had people like Walata Petros, who in the 17th century had her own biography, and it talked about how she led a resistance movement against the king, even against her own husband, and was imprisoned for her rejection of European Christianity, or as her biography calls it, the filthy European faith. But later she ended up convincing the king to reject European Christianity. And so then she was released from prison, and she founded a monastery on Lake Tana. And that's, and then she said that, blessed be God who did not deliver us to the treacherous net of the Europeans. And so again, another important figure in Ethiopian Christianity is Zara Yacob, who was the king of Ethiopia in the 15th century. And again, notice the way in which Christianity is so embraced and celebrated. He says about his people, the people of Ethiopia are gracious and lovers of religious education. He says even more so than peoples of Rome, New Rome, Greece, and Constantinople. He says the faith, again, the hymenot of the people of Ethiopia is as bright as the sun. And so he celebrates the highest attribute of his people is their faith, their hymenot. And this is a picture of the churches I was telling you about in Lalibela. That's a unique style of architecture that is both uniquely African, Ethiopian in particular, and Christian, because it's a monolithic church that's cut into the ground. So it's really actually a sculpture more than a building, but it's literally carved, a 3-story church into the ground. And this is still an active church. Actually, someone's reading liturgy right there. So if you ever have a chance to go to Lalibela in Ethiopia, I highly recommend it. There's like a dozen of these massive churches, and then other ones all throughout the area. And then also you see the way in which Jesus and Mary and angels were depicted with African features and hair and phenotype. This is a prayer book from a monastery that was founded in the 6th century. Also, if you're familiar with the Reformation, Ethiopia actually had a Reformation even before Europe did. You've heard of Martin Luther and John Calvin, but Stephanos was actually a reformer in Ethiopia a century before Martin Luther in the early 1300s, in the early 1400s. And Stephanos, this is him engaging with the king of Ethiopia, who had imprisoned him because he was trying to reform many of the practices in Ethiopia and some of the theology, where he was arguing by salvation by grace and not by works. And he was arguing for the supremacy of the Bible over church tradition, and also advocated a more kind of active personal prayer life and relationship with Jesus as opposed to going through the priest as a mediator. So many of the same arguments that Martin Luther and others were making in Europe, but he was making them a century earlier and was imprisoned, which is why he's appealing to the king, saying, why did you act this way? Why did you summon us? And the scriptures say, blessed are those who observe justice. He's appealing for himself. And he also refused to prostrate to the king, which was the common practice, and was beaten and ultimately killed because of that. But his movement lived on. And even to this day in Ethiopia, there are almost as many Protestants as there are Orthodox now. And for the Protestant Ethiopian community and Eritrea, Stephanos is considered a hero and the founder of the, Protestantism in Africa, long before Europeans came. And then the final thing I'll say about Africa is, as I mentioned, this is something I'm working on now, but there is evidence that Christianity spread even further west outside of these more well-known civilizations along the Nile Valley. But here's an example. If you've heard of Mansa Musa, who was the king of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, and he was seen as the wealthiest person in the world because this is before Europeans began to take gold from West Africa. And so this would have been the areas of Africa today known as Burkina Faso and Niger and Western Nigeria and northern Ghana, northern Benin, and Senegal. All of that would have been considered not just modern Mali, but the Mali Empire was all along the Niger River, going all the way to the Atlantic coast. And Mansa Musa was a Muslim because, again, Islam came in the 11th century in West Africa by force. It was in force, and that's actually how slaves began to be taken from West Africa up into Morocco and then over across the Maghreb. And so as a Muslim, he was going to Mecca for the pilgrimage and stopped into Egypt on the way. And the Egyptians were really fascinated by all the gold he had. In fact, he like broke the economy in Egypt because they were selling so much gold in the streets, and the people were interested in the gold. And this historian in Egypt recorded asking them, where did this gold come from? And then notice what he says. He says, the gold is not in our land, which is the property of the Muslims, but it's in the land that's the property of the Christians of Takur. And Takur was it was one of the regions of what was called the Mali Empire, but it was also just a name for the whole kingdom. And so there was apparently a whole Christian section, but he goes on to even say that not only that, but they said, well, why don't you just conquer their land? He says, when we conquer it, the gold stops growing, but when we leave it to the Christians, it continues to grow. And again, this is according to a Muslim Egyptian source in the 14th century, quoting the king of the Mali Empire. And also, this is a potsherd from the modern border of Chad and Sudan and Darfur region with a cross and a Christian fish symbol in a settlement that some people think may have even been a monastery. And it would have been about 400 miles to the west of the Nile River, which is where the center of the Nubian kingdom was. So this is just a couple of hints showing how Christianity was spreading even further west in Africa. Okay, and then to make a few comments, I'm gonna try to go fast so we have time to have some Q&A about Asia. So on the continent we now call Asia, again, Christianity was also present all over the continent, and really from along the Silk Road it spread, and from the very beginning in the Arabian Peninsula, of course Mesopotamia, where Christianity is from, and also throughout the Persian Empire, and all of it spread through a language called Syriac. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic that was spoken primarily in this city called Edessa and the surrounding region called Asrahini, which was an independent kingdom and actually embraced Christianity as its dominant religion in the 3rd century. And the greatest writer in the history of the Syriac language is Ephraim the Syrian. So Ephraim the Syrian is another one of these names that we should know. He's probably one of the ones that is starting to get more traction in scholarship, and there's even some of his writings you can read in English. But Ephraim was a monk, and he was also a theologian and head of the Seminary of Edessa, where he was from. And he actually wrote a lot of different genres of literature, Bible commentaries, sermons, treatises, letters. But one of his most famous genres of literature were called madrashe. And madrashe are a Syriac form of literature that are actually poems that are written in 7-syllable lines, and which are meant to be sung to music in a communal corporate context. And actually, before Ephraim moved to Edessa, he fled his native city because it was conquered by the Persians, and that's when Christians were being persecuted there. He actually he kind of appropriated this cultural form, which was predominantly used in the traditional religion of Edessa, which was called Bardaisanism, and which was kind of a fusion of Christianity and Zoroastrianism and Gnosticism. And he actually used that cultural form of public musical poetry and used it to communicate Christian orthodoxy. And he also had a big emphasis on the role of creation in theology. And so this is an area where Ephraim is a really good entry point for people who come, like First Nations or indigenous peoples who come from contexts or African cultures where nature and creation is seen as a place of divine revelation. And that's how Ephraim understood it. For Ephraim, the Bible and nature were the two prominent ways of seeing the rose of God, or symbols. So for Ephraim, symbols were the way of doing theology. So he was in the 300s, contemporary people like Basil the Great or Gregory of Nazianzus or Jerome or Athanasius, but he did theology in a very much more indigenously Syriac way, even by doing it through the mechanism of poetry. But also he was very much against the attempt of trying to place hard definitions on God, or he would say not investigating God, but rather just drinking from the fountain of the rose, or the symbols that God pours forth, mainly, which are scripture and creation. So in this example, he's talking about a pearl, and he says, one day I held a pearl and I saw a rose, I saw symbols, witnesses to the kingdom, images and signs of his majesty, and it became a fountain from which I drank the mysteries of the sun. And then there was a response, or a new onitho that the crowd would say in response to, in the middle of above the madroshe of the song. And then he says, I placed it in the palm of my hand, and I saw that its face was on all sides, and I found out that the sun is incomprehensible, for he is completely light. And so this is just one example of how part of his theological method that again, one cannot fully understand God or the mysteries of the Son, but we can just get like this pearl was just a window into like kind of a keyhole looking into the mysteries of God. Another context in what we call Asia was Armenia, and Armenia is the oldest current still existing Christian nation, and King Tiridates embraced Christianity in the early 300s, a decade before Constantine, and then a few decades later in the mid 300s, Armenia's embracing of Christianity inspired them to create an alphabet. As I mentioned, the oldest sub-Saharan African writing system in the world, the first thing written in it was the Bible. Well, it's the same thing in Armenia. They had a spoken language, but their scripture was used either in Syriac or Greek, and they wanted to have their own Bible translated. So they commissioned Mesrop Mashtotes to create an alphabet from a mixture of Greek and Persian and Syriac letters, and created the Armenian. And this is actually the first sentence written in the Armenian language, which was from Proverbs 1, verse 2. And when they created the alphabet and translated the entire scriptures, his biography celebrates this. And notice how it says that now because of his work, Moses and Paul and Jesus and the apostles were now Armenian speaking. And so it shows the sense in which Christianity really gave them a stronger sense of their ethnic and linguistic identity. Christianity also spread into India very early, no later than the 3rd century, is when you see texts talking about the Apostle Thomas going down to the subcontinent and spreading Christianity. And there certainly was a Jewish community in southwestern India in the 1st century. This is very probable. But the first on-the-ground report of Christians in India comes from an Egyptian traveler who went to India in the 6th century and says, and this is a part where he went from India to Sri Lanka, and says that on Sri Lanka there was a church of Persian Christians who have settled there, and a presbyter who is appointed from Persia. And so, as I mentioned, the Persian Empire, where Syriac-speaking Christianity was founded, spread all throughout Asia into India, and then later along the Silk Road. And this is a style of cross that was found in India from the 9th century. And actually, if you notice the Persian inscription along the edges here, showing that Persian connection that the Church of India had. But it also contextualized local Buddhist imagery, because you see a cross with a Holy Spirit dove coming on the top, but on top of a lotus flower, which is a symbol of enlightenment or nirvana in Buddhism. So this is showing a contextualized form of Christian iconography in India. And there was several of these crosses found throughout India. And then also Christianity coming back into the Middle East, after the rise of Islam and the dominance of Arabic, Christianity then began to be articulated in Arabic as well. In fact, even before Islam, some of the earliest Arabic inscriptions were actually on Christian graves. So you see Arabic inscriptions with crosses. And so even before the Quran was written, Christianity, Arabic inscriptions were from Christians. But this is actually an excerpt of the first text ever written in Arabic by a Christian in the mid 8th century. And this is an attempt to explain Trinitarian theology, which, as you probably know, is the biggest kind of point of theological divergence between Christianity and Islam. The idea of the Trinity, from a Muslim perspective, the idea of God having a son through a human woman is very different. In the Quran specifically addresses that point of Christian theology. So this text, written by an unnamed author, attempts to articulate the Trinity, but in the Arabic language and even from an Islamic context. So he throughout the text, he doesn't use the word Trinity, and he doesn't talk about fathers and sons, but rather he talks about God, Allah, His Word, and His Spirit as a way of and even demonstrating from the prophets and the Psalms that God and His Spirit and His Word are one God and one man. So he's really trying to communicate that Christian doctrine, but in an Arabic context and way that makes sense. And then finally, along the Christianity continued to spread along the Silk Road, and by the 7th century, it also arrived in China. So in the 600s, there were already Christians in China, and this is probably one of the most famous pieces of evidence. This is still in Xi'an today, which was the capital of China in the Tang Dynasty, and it tells the story of a Persian missionary named Alopin who first brought Christianity in the 600s and was allowed to spread Christianity all throughout China. So if you look back at this map, there were churches in Xi'an in the capital, but all throughout the Chinese Tang Dynasty empire. And also there, other than this stela, there were also a handful of texts that were discovered in a cave that were also written in the Tang period, that were Christian theological texts written in Chinese. And also this icon was discovered in the same cave, and it's thought to be a Christian or maybe even Jesus himself, which is really interesting to see a depiction of Jesus from sometime between the 7th and 10th century, drawn with East Asian phenotypical features. But also theologically and linguistically, Christianity was contextualized to the Chinese culture, because you notice it says that this is talking about the incarnation, saying that God caused the cool breeze to come upon a chosen young woman called Moyan, or Mary, who had no husband, and she became pregnant. The whole world saw this and understood what God had wrought. The power of God is such that it can create a bodily spirit and lead to the clear, pure path of compassion. So you see in ways in which Christianity was contextualized also to Buddhist and Taoist ideas and kind of worldviews. In the stela, it also talks about how Jesus came to the world to show the 4 cardinal paths, which is a concept that's really common in Buddhism as well. So you see a lot of the ways Christianity was contextualized. And then Christianity actually died out in China in the 10th century, but then it came back during the Mongolian period, when the Mongols ruled China and pretty much most of Asia. And during the 12th and 13th century, the rulers of the Mongolian dynasty, like Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and others, most of them had Christian wives. And so most of the Khans had Christian mothers, queen mothers. And so even though they weren't Christians, they practiced traditional Tangrian religion. They were cosmopolitan, allowed for Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, all religions to thrive throughout the Mongolian Empire. So this gave Christianity another opportunity to grow throughout China and throughout Central Asia. And one of the most well-known figures of that time was the name Robin Salma, who was a Chinese Christian monk who was from Beijing. And he actually traveled all the way from Beijing all the way to Paris and to Rome. And he was basically trying to get the crusade started again, because he was commissioned by the patriarch of the Church of the East in Baghdad, again, which that church, the Church of the East, really ruled the church of all of Asia, like in Central East and Southeast and South Asia. And the idea was that if the Church of the East throughout Asia and the Mongols could join together with the Europeans, then maybe they could defeat the Muslims who were gang up on them in between. Obviously that didn't happen, but that was the purpose of his journey. But what did happen was an interesting interaction, and kind of one of the earliest global travelers before Marco Polo or William Rubruck or other people, and seeing from an Eastern perspective going west. And he even had an interesting conversation where he met the popes and the cardinals of Rome, and then talked about how our fathers, talking about the Persian church, have gone throughout the country, the Mongols, Turks, Chinese, and taught them the gospel. And in the present time, there are many Mongols who are Christians. And then he went about discussing their theology. If you've ever heard of Nestorianism, which is not the right name to use for this church, they call themselves the Church of the East, and Nestorius was not their father, but that was why they were condemned as heretics. But and they still are seen that way as many people today. Today they're called the Assyrian Church of the East, and most of them are from Iraq or from in the Iraqi diaspora. But he actually told them their doctrine, and when he was talking to the cardinals in Rome, and said their unique doctrine, which again was not the Western doctrine of Jesus being one person and two natures, but rather from an East Syriac perspective, they taught that Jesus is one person with two kiane, each of which have their own kanome. And so again, it gets into East Syriac and Persian ways of viewing personhood and natures. But they actually embraced it as, oh yeah, you guys are Orthodox like us. So it's kind of interesting that in the 13th century, the popes thought that his theology theology was orthodox, and today they don't. But then finally, the last thing I'll mention is just like with Africa, Christianity spread into other parts of Asia in ways that we can just get glimpses of into further regions. And, like in Southeast Asia, for example, this is a grave in a Sumatra region of Indonesia that actually has Christian graves on it that go back to the 11th century. And then also, this is the journal of a Italian traveler, Ludovico de Vartema, who traveled to Thailand in the 16th century and mentioned how that there were already Christians present in Thailand. Says that in their country, in Thailand, there were many lords who are also Christian, and they're subject to the great Khan of Cathay. And so this is referring to the Mongolian dynasty, which is by the 16th century was not in power anymore. So it's probably a misidentification, which they were actually under the Church of the East, which was centered in the former Persian region. So again, this is just a glimpse into how Christianity probably spread in other parts of Southeast Asia and maybe even further southeast. Because again, that area was very connected through trade and commerce. So anyway, I'm sorry. I know we went a little over, so I don't know if we have time for questions and comments. But anyway, that's just a little kind of summary introduction to some of these regions. But I don't know if we have any time for questions and comments. But
yeah. I think we have a little time for questions and answers. Can we applaud you first?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Just one very important, but small but important thing. You referred to some people as slaves. There are no slaves on the planet. There are enslaved people. To respect the dignity of the people who were kidnapped, it's better that we stop using that term, if you don't mind. Now, apart from that, you had mentioned something about language, about writing systems, about the first writing systems. You had stuff written about Christianity. I find that peculiar because I know that there are writing systems that predate Europe. So they're ancient African writing systems, but what you said didn't quite acknowledge that. So I don't know if you're familiar with ancient African writing systems that predate Christianity and Islam or not.
Which ones are you referring to?
There are so many. Yorubas have their own writing systems. The Akan do. All the different peoples in Cameroon and areas do. So we had ancient writing systems that when we were invaded, they tried to suppress and destroy. But we do have writing systems. I believe we taught the rest of the world how to write and read. And then they came back to us and pretended like we didn't. But other than that, I'm really loving what you're sharing. Last question is, I heard somewhere, there was a Yoruba writer who was talking about the connections between Ifism and Christianity. And that there is supposedly one of the most respected people who's mentioned a lot in the New Testament, that Jesus Christ was a priest in the order of, and I forget his name. But anyway, that person has been traced back to Yoruba land. And so there's talk about actually Christianity being an offshoot of ancient West African religions. Have you come up with that in your research?
No, I would. Yeah, in fact, there's evidence to the contrary that Ife were themselves received Christianity. But yeah, if you want to check out.
I grew up in Ife land, so I know our history. Yeah, no, it's the other way.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Adnan Hussain at St. Mary's. I was wondering, how did these groups in Africa think of each other? So what were their classification systems, and to what extent were they acknowledging each other's Christianity, or was there that level of interaction between these groups? And if that's emerged in your research?
Yeah, there'd be a lot of different examples of that. I don't, the whole continent with different people. So I think there'd be a wide variety of ways to answer that in terms of, how different African groups during this period interacted with each other. In the Nile Valley in Egypt and Nubia and Ethiopia, which and also what's now Eritrea, these regions would have all predominantly been united theologically under the Pope of Alexandria. So even Ethiopia and Nubia, they even into Islamic times even though they were independent kingdoms. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic because the church in Egypt was politically subservient or kind of subjugated to the Islamic caliphates from the 7th century going forward. But that church was theologically kind of over the churches of Nubia and Ethiopia, which were politically independent. So it created a kind of an interesting dynamic sometimes where even Ethiopia and Nubia were reliant upon Egypt to ordain their priests and their bishops and to for even Bible translation and for all other things, but they were politically independent. So there were times where they would threaten there'd be tension between the Muslim rulers of Egypt and the kings of Ethiopia and Nubia because of that. And then now in North Africa, they were from the time of that schism I mentioned in 451, they were actually theologically in line with Rome and Constantinople. So most of the Christians in North Africa from 451 up until the Islamic conquest would have been Chalcedonian. So they would have also seen the churches of Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia as heretics also. So they, and then they, this is another thing I'm working on now, but a lot of people said that after the time of Islam, Christianity in North Africa just went away. But actually, there's evidence showing that they continued and persisted, even well into the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries, and they likely would have still continued to be Chalcedonian. So there was that, there was that difference. And then, but yeah, there's just a lot of examples. There was also, issues of skin color difference that also affected the way people in North Africa and Egypt related to Nubians and Ethiopians that emerged a lot of times in Christian texts. One of the best examples of that is a person named Moses the Black, who was an Egyptian, he was a Nubian descended monk in Egypt, and he endured a lot of racism and colorism from the other Egyptian monks that he lived around. So, and then, also another way to look at that would be also in Ethiopia in the 13th and 14th centuries, there was a lot of political expansion, and the kings of Ethiopia were beginning to dominate other surrounding ethnic groups, and many of whom practiced traditional religion. So you get a glimpse of kind of the way in which Christians in these regions would have seen practitioners of indigenous religion as, pagans, or the words they would have used, or heretics and things like that. Yes.
Yeah, is it out of the question that the Reformation, Martin Luther, might have got his ideas from Africa? I'm just thinking, for example, there was a lot more travel around than we travelers of the 21st century think there was in medieval times, right? And I'm just thinking, for instance, of the Black Death. And what was that, the 14th century, 1300 or something? And there were questionings which must have involved travel, because that's how it was spread largely in Europe and into England. And I know that after the Black Death in England, there were questionings. There were peasant revolts, for example, questionings of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and so on. So I'm just wondering, is there any evidence that that you might not maybe firm evidence, but conjecture that maybe Luther and so on got his ideas from Africa or other areas?
Yeah, I have a friend who he's in Chicago at McCormick Seminary. His name is David Daniels, and he's done a lot of work on that very thought. That's been his argument, and it is true that Luther even himself had a relationship with an Ethiopian delegate who came and visited Europe. His name was Michael the Deacon, and Luther talks about his conversations he had with this Michael, and he even himself said that the Christianity of Ethiopia was closer to biblical Christianity than the Catholic Church of Germany in his day, and so I have to look at Dr. Daniels' work a little bit more closely just to see, because that person who he met would have likely been an Orthodox Christian and not, the group I was talking about, because that group was extremely persecuted and there's no way they would have been able to travel to Europe. And so, it was just, so I don't know to what extent exactly Luther meant by that, like what aspects of Ethiopian Christianity he felt were closer to biblical Christianity, but that would be someone that he's written several articles about that topic. Yeah, but it's just interesting to me that that there is this clear connection that Luther did have to Ethiopian Christianity, and it's really interesting that there was also a Reformation happening there that was already well underway, and even during Luther's time was already in the process of being strongly stamped out. And so it's just it's ironic to me. I'm like, well, did Luther know that this person that he looked up to was actually part of a church that was suppressing similar movements in Ethiopia? Yeah. Oh, yes.
I just looked it up. Are you familiar with the Jebusites?
The biblical Jebusites?
Jebusites.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay. The Jebusites are Ijebu people. Ijebu people are Yoruba people from Niger Delta. And the high priest name, I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's Melkizedek. Are you familiar?
Melchizedek? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's the Ijebu.
Okay, that's an interesting theory.
No, so I know you're doing research on this. I think one of the things that happens when I also teach African history, but outside of university, is that sometimes we buy the lies of the people who colonized us. Because if they tell us that we didn't have any writing systems until they came, then people don't go looking for them. And so they miss that point. But that particular person is referred to as one of the most respected people in the Bible. And if you trace his lineage back, you can actually trace him back to West Africa, which will counter your original hypothesis that Ifa came after Christianity. The other way around.
Okay, yeah, it'd be nice to have some evidence to show that.
But I'm glad to show you.
Okay, yeah.
Have you found any challenges from other majority white Christian institutions into some of the things that you're like? How has it been? Has it been accepted? Has it been debated? How are you finding the reception of your research?
Yeah, I would say that in majority white spaces that I would say that maybe in religious spaces, one pushback is often the thing I mentioned earlier about the Christological schism that occurred in the 5th century. And I think when I make the case that many of these Christians in Africa and Asia were also, Orthodox Christians, that's oftentimes that gets pushed back. And then when I'm suggesting that the Council of Chalcedon unjustifiably, even though actually Pope John Paul II himself signed a joint statement with the Patriarch of the Church of the East in the 90s saying that these theological divisions we had in the 5th century were just linguistic misunderstandings and they don't touch the core of our faith. even still in not only the Catholic world, but even I would say the Western Christian world, whether it's, you know, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or Protestant, that there's this kind of loyalty to the Council of Chalcedon, which entails that the 2/3 of the world's Christians, for most of Christianity, were not real Christians. And so that's some pushback on that in religious circles. I think in academic white circles, there's another pushback is there can be I would say kind of there's a resistance to speaking about things like racism in antiquity and saying, well, that's anachronistic and that racism is a modern phenomenon. And so I just mentioned like Moses the Black, and that's a big debate even in early Christian studies, late antique studies, classical studies about can you speak of race or racism in the ancient world, and people are largely divided on that issue. Scholars are, and I've met very few scholars of color who would argue against the existence of racism in antiquity, but usually people who would push back on that and say that's anachronistic are usually white scholars who probably themselves don't have a strong sense of even how racism or white supremacy function in the modern world. And so therefore it's, you know, can be tempting to just kind of use anachronism as an easy way of getting out of dealing with clear examples in artistic representations and literary examples of colorism in the ancient world. So that's one issue that comes up also.
All right. Any other questions left? All right. So. Thank you so much, Dr. Bantu, for such an insightful lecture. I think very counterintuitive to what we probably are familiar with. So next year, I think we'll continue with the current lecture, so we can for some more series. So I think most of us are already aware of it. So we'll communicate with the rest of you what happens for January, February, and March as well. So